Welcome back, Ohio State fans, to the 11 Dubcast for Monday morning, September 8th. After another successful weekend for Ohio State football, albeit one we were probably expecting a bit more than maybe the opener. But in any event, I am joined by I introduced him last week as the lead producer, but that I was actually wrong. He is the senior producer. Although we didn't start recording until after his promotion was announced, but he is now the senior producer at 11 Warriors. Chase Brown. Chase, how is the senior producer doing today?
Doing fantastic. Yeah, I actually didn't know at the time of the recording that was going to happen, but Dan had let me know. Our lead editor, Dan Hope, had let me know in the meantime. And yeah, a new promotion, new title. I'm feeling pretty good right now, George, I got to say.
Glad to hear it. Before we get into the show today, I do want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, for sponsoring the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this football season. So thank you very much to First Bank of Central Ohio. And I'm gonna be honest. I know you and Dan and Andy, and Andy, I believe, was sporting quite a few different pieces of flair relative to the
He
Cincinnati
was.
Bengals on the show you guys did. You guys went pretty in depth on that Grambling State Ohio State game, and while I was happy to see the win, I have to say I don't know how much substance can really be gleaned out of a game in which the reserves score as many points in the second half as the starters did in the first half. Much as we all got a kick out of seeing Riley Pettijohn have great game, uh, Julian saying, complete, what was it, 15, 16 passes to start the game, and set a new record at Ohio State for most consecutive completions to start a game. I feel like it's probably been hit over ad nauseum at this point, and it is, an FCS team. What I would be more excited to talk about with you today, especially as a show of respect to the Dubcast original founder, Johnny Ginter, who arguably despised Michigan more than he loved Ohio State, which is a feeling that I very much understand and sympathize with. Michigan was in the lead game of the weekend. They played a much more competent opponent than Ohio State did. They were in prime time. They were playing Oklahoma. They had big noon kickoff and college game day, and all the eyes were on Norman, Oklahoma, and one Bryce Underwood, who one member of the Big Noon Kickoff crew, who shall remain nameless, and has since communicated that he's not going to be on Big Noon Kickoff next week for whatever reason, called Bryce Underwood the best college football freshman ever, which is amusing if you're an Ohio State fan, having watched, Jeremiah Smith play only a season ago and still not even ascend past underclassman status yet. Michigan did not have a great night. They were the underdog in that game. I think most people were probably not expecting them to win, but we're probably also expecting a more competitive game and probably expecting a bit better of a showing out of Bryce Underwood. I thought Bryce Underwood started the game well, but things as the game started to kind of get away from them went off the rails a little bit. He ultimately only completed 9 of his 24 pass attempts, and was far from the lofty expectations that were thrust onto him. So I'm curious, Chase, what you were expecting from Bryce Underwood, given this stern test early in his career, and just what are your overall thoughts on Michigan coming out of that early season test last night that they didn't exactly pass with flying colors, to say the least?
Yeah, I think Bryce Underwood, the noise around him is doing a disservice to him as a player, particularly with the analyst that will remain nameless, but I'll have to name him just because he's been annoying me for the past couple of weeks. But Dave Portnoy calling him the greatest freshman college football player he's ever seen when his only reps were against New Mexico last week is something that I don't think does well to Bryce Underwood as a player as he continues to become more comfortable as Michigan's quarterback. You could see the potential of what he can be. And so I don't think that Ohio State fans would be wise to write him off considering the performance he had against Oklahoma. You mentioned he was only 9 of 24 passing for 142 yards. He didn't really show too much as a runner, which was surprising to me. I thought that you would, if you're Michigan, put him in more running situations just so that he can have more of an impact on the game. And it's not like they weren't having success on the ground. Justice Haynes had 19 carries for 125 yards and a score. So it just felt like the game plan was not necessarily where it needed to be for him to have success. And then when the plays were there to be made, he didn't make them. And so I just think when you have this lofty reputation being set before you that you're going to be the greatest freshman that anyone has ever seen, knowing too that Jeremiah Smith came onto the scene last year and was one of the greatest freshmen players that anyone has ever seen, you just start to kind of see this difference, this gap between who Bryce Underwood actually is as a player right now, currently, and what people are kind of saying he is. I certainly think he can be a great quarterback and somebody that Ohio State needs to respect, but I just don't think that he really showed it on Saturday night in Norman. And I think Oklahoma in that matchup definitely made him look like a freshman quarterback, like someone that still needs to develop.
Yeah, I one of the things that I talked about the first time we had Jones on a couple weeks ago was that, and even going back to when I was hosting the show with Johnny last season, was that I was someone that was cautiously optimistic about Jeremiah Smith, but I didn't want to jump all the way in with the narrative that this guy was already going to be one of the best Ohio State receivers ever. And people were saying that, even the coaching staff were saying that during practice when he was, supposedly getting all these one-handed catches and everything. And I I drew the comparison, and I think as a Cleveland sports fan, you'll appreciate this as much as Jones did. I made the comparison to LeBron James, in
Yep.
that is, unless you are a superhuman figure like that, it is nigh impossible to live up to that kind of expectation before you've actually had an opportunity to go realize the results. And, especially in a sport like football compared to basketball, basketball, you've got several more games in which to kind of bounce back from bad performances. You have one bad performance with football, you're waiting another week to kind of set the record or bounce back or correct the narrative before you get a real opportunity. You just don't have as many chances to, display your ability as you do in basketball. So the margin for error when you've got that level of expectation is so much smaller. I do still expect great things for Bryce Underwood. I didn't know how quickly they were going to manifest. I do think he started the game early well. I think one area in which I do kind of disagree with you, and this kind of leads into my next point, is that I thought outside of that run that Justice Haynes had, which I thought was really more of a reflection of the mistakes that Oklahoma made in their alignment than anything Michigan necessarily did well. They had that was one of those Jim Harbaugh formations where they sub out all the receivers and they put in offensive linemen to kind of act as like extra tight ends. They had like 7 or 8 offensive linemen on the line of scrimmage. You knew they were going to run, and Oklahoma just didn't have the right personnel out for it or whatever, missed their lanes and their gaps, and then Haynes took off. You take away that one play, and their run game largely looked like a disaster. This did not look like the dominant line of scrimmage team at Michigan that has beaten Ohio State now for several years in a row. And it makes me wonder. It makes me a couple things. Number one, it makes me very optimistic about Ohio State, even at this early point in the season, that they're going to be able to finally handle business against Michigan this year for the first time since before the pandemic. I'm already feeling very good about that based on what we've seen from Ohio State on both sides of the line of scrimmage in these first 2 games, especially against a formidable opponent like Texas. And then coming out of that Oklahoma game last night for Michigan, I thought that was easily where they looked the most dreadful. And with a better supporting cast, I think Bryce Underwood probably makes a better impression than what he's been able to do so far. That is kind of a reflection on Sherrone more, and it makes me wonder, had Ohio State actually been able to get that win last year, how much different would the narrative around Sherrone Moore be right now? Because that win largely salvaged Michigan's season. I know they went on to beat Alabama in their bowl game, and that kind of gave them a nice little cherry on top of the sundae, if you want to call it a Sunday of a season for them last year. But the Ohio State game was obviously the thing that they were most thrilled about, and it kind of washed the taste out of their mouths of what was otherwise a really unpalatable title defense campaign for a lot of that fan base. Now we're kind of back to the point again after this performance, even though they weren't favored to win, where you look at their schedule, and I expect them to win out at home up until they play Ohio State, because they're playing a lot of relatively softer teams in the conference. They're going to be playing Central Michigan at home in their next game, which, you got to imagine Connor Stalions is going to tune in for that one. Maybe he'll even be on the sideline. However, I'm going out on a limb, and I'm saying that they're going to lose their next 3 road games, which are Nebraska, USC, and then they have to go to East Lansing to play Michigan State. And Sparty's going to gear up for that one. So I think we could very easily be looking at a situation where Michigan is hovering around a 500 record again, very far into the season. And for a team that started out the year ranked inside the AP top 15, is that going to be enough for Michigan fans if they're at that point where they're just kind of treading water again? So I guess this is a very long-winded way for me to ask you, how are you feeling about Sherrone Moore's future in Michigan after this performance relative to what last season kind of revealed about how a lot of fans felt about him prior to the Ohio State win?
My answer to that question would be twofold. One, ask me on November 29th, because how Sherrone Moore and Michigan perform against Ohio State could very well be exactly as what you just mentioned from the 2024 season. Was his win over Ohio State salvaged what otherwise was an underwhelming season, especially for the talent that Michigan had on its roster coming off of a national championship. I mean, you're talking about Mason Graham and Will Johnson and Kenneth Grant and guys like that. I know Johnson didn't really play too much toward the latter half of last season, but they certainly had talent, and I feel like that roster underperformed. I also think another way to answer that question would be, it kind of depends on how Sherrone Moore chooses to weaponize Bryce Underwood as a player. I think that this comparison might get me in trouble with some people, but I think if Michigan starts to weaponize Bryce Underwood in the way that Luke Fickell weaponized Braxton Miller in 2011, then maybe Sherrone Moore starts to stick around. Ohio State did not have a great season in 2011. We all remember it. They went 5-7, but it was Braxton Miller's freshman season, and Braxton Miller completed somewhere around 55% of his passes, but he was electric as a dual threat player. And so if you can start to see some of the potential of Bryce Underwood as a quarterback for the Wolverines, I think you could maybe see Sherrone Moore sticking around. And then obviously how he performs on the recruiting trail matters a lot as well. But I can't say either of those two things, Michigan beating Ohio State on the 29th of November, and then Sherrone Moore figuring out a way to weaponize Bryce Underwood, that I'm extremely confident in his ability to do either of those two things. So as for how that affects his long-term future at Michigan, I'm not necessarily sure. We do know now that he's serving a 2-game suspension this season for his involvement in the Connor Stalions case. He'll serve another suspension, 1 game next year, for his involvement in the case. And so I don't necessarily know if people in Ann Arbor were expecting him to be the long-term solution as the head coach, or was he always just meant to be this guy that fell on the sword for all the things that happened at Michigan during the Connor Stalions saga and the sign-stealing schemes. And I think that he has the opportunity to turn the tides, but I would agree with you, George. I don't necessarily think they have what it takes to win in environments like Nebraska, to go out west and win in the Coliseum. Like, those are games that are going to be tough. Those are games that are going to really determine the momentum of that program the rest of this season. And so there's definitely a lot of question marks moving forward for his tenure.
Well, I certainly hope the lunatic fringe doesn't come after you for daring to compare Bryce Underwood to Braxton Miller.
I don't think right now that it is that absurd of a comparison, considering the comparisons for him coming into Michigan were that he is Cam Newton, and that, he's the number 1 overall prospect in this class. He's got tremendous size and arm strength and athleticism. Michigan did not use him like that against Oklahoma, and I don't know that they necessarily will use him like that moving forward. But if they're going to have success, I think that's the recipe for it. And I think that's something that Ohio State has to keep tabs on for their game in November is his ability to run the football and their ability to contain him in the pocket if they want to win and kind of reset the narrative around the game.
Yeah, I do think that he has a higher ceiling as a thrower than Braxton did. So the I think I can understand where the Cam Newton comparison comes from. When we were all discussing all the staff were discussing the game as it was happening Saturday night, I really liked the comparison that Johnny drew between Bryce Underwood to Terrell Pryor, not only in terms of
That's a good
player
one too.
profile and
Yep.
ability, but also, it feels like just because of the system Jim Tressel had, they never really got to the ceiling of what Terrell Pryor was advertised as coming out of high school compared to what he could do. And I feel like, given the program that Michigan runs, it's probably going to be something similar to Bryce Underwood, where we probably don't even see the best of what this guy has to offer until he ends up playing in the NFL, or maybe he gets tired of Michigan and hits the portal. I would like to see. I would like to see Sherrone Moore stick around Michigan longer than Bryce Underwood, certainly. But I
I mean,
guess we'll
LSU is going
only.
to come calling, right? He was committed to LSU and was about to
I hope
sign on
so.
the dotted line before Michigan gave him 10, $12 million in NIL cash. So not out of the realm of possibility that depending on what the clauses of his contracts look like, that he could eventually go down and replace Garrett Nussmeier down there in a year or two.
Yeah, take the. I don't know how much of that is guaranteed, but take the guaranteed money and run. That would be my financial advice to Bryce Underwood in that situation. But it's still a long season. Maybe Michigan will hit their stride. I certainly don't hope to see it, but I have a feeling that they're going to have a very similar bit of below expectation season compared, or in tandem with what happened last year. But regardless of how good or how bad they are, Ohio State is still going to need to take care of business on November 29th, as you alluded to earlier in the conversation. So we've still got plenty of time, but we're going to keep, they say keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and we'll keep a watchful eye on Michigan as the season unfolds. And yeah, we felt it was important to discuss them given they had the prime time slot over the weekend, as opposed to Ohio State, who certainly did well against Grambling State. But you and Dan and Andy, I think, did a good job of recapping everything that happened with that one. So with that in mind, thank you very much for tuning into the 11 Dubcast. We will be back tomorrow morning to tease this week's film study coming out of the Grambling State game with Kyle Jones. So we hope you'll all tune in for that. Until then, thank you, and we'll see you then. Take care, folks.